Hello, my name's James Hodkinson and I teach German language and culture in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at Warwick University. I'm also, as it happens, the head of recruitment admissions, so I spend a lot of time going out into schools talking to A-level groups, rather like yourselves, about modern languages and offering them enrichment sessions. So I'm going to be offering you precisely one of those today. My talk is entitled, "Where do you come from? Mixed identity in multicultural Germany." Well, that question, where do you come from, is very often seen as a rather intrusive, almost racist question that gets asked of people living in multicultural societies about their ethnic or political or cultural origins. But it is also a quite deep philosophical question because it asks us where it is we belong in many ways. Now, although my title seems very much focused on German, and the materials I'm going to be dealing with are pertinent to German, certainly they're provided in translation so that you can really get a handle on these issues and hopefully apply them to different modern languages. For example, if you're studying French or Spanish or Italian, it's very rare nowadays that we simply think of those cultures in terms of the white mainstream societies of those countries. We think very much about the cultural complexity of these places, of these nations. We think about the different communities which make up those societies, and also possibly different locations around the world where those languages are spoken. So by thinking about the idea of mixed identity, which is going to be at the heart of our presentation today, hopefully you'll get some concepts and ideas, see how you can use them when you're talking about texts and images, and possibly transfer them to other language areas as well, if German is not your thing. So to begin with, a brief overview of how I'm going to structure this presentation. Firstly, I'm going to be looking at some theoretical ideas taken from social and cultural theory, which outline the way in which identities are not fixed things which we're born with, they're not innate, but they're things which get made for us in culture and which we in turn also make for ourselves. Taking that rather abstract theory, I'm going to then place it in an historical context. I'm going to be asking in part 2 how post-Second World War Germany became a multicultural society, followed a very different route to, say, Britain or France. Thirdly, I'm going to be looking at those communities that came to Germany, making it multicultural, and asking how the passage of time and indeed generational issues changed things. How did the birth of subsequent generations of people with migration background, as the Germans call it, actually change their experience and the society in which they lived? Fourthly, I'm going to be looking at how the generation which grew up in these migrant communities grew up in fact with a much more complex, a mixed sense of their identity, or as is sometimes referred to, a hybrid sense of themselves. And once we've got that in place, in the fifth and final part, I'm going to be looking at two cultural sources. One, a poem, the other, an excerpt from a TV series, from Netflix no less, as a way of trying to illustrate how these ideas can help us to think critically about cultural identity in a multicultural society. And once we've had those thoughts, I'm going to go and set us some questions to go away and think about, which we'll then come back to in our actual session. Let's start with some of that social and cultural theory. It's taken from the work of a British Caribbean philosopher by the name of Stuart Hall, who was for many years a leading theorist in this area at the University of Birmingham. If you don't get this first time round, then don't worry about it. I really just want to see if you can take the gist away from this text and carry that idea through into our discussions. About identity, Hall says that identity is not something that is simply given to us. It's not a matter of your passport. It's not simply a matter of your religion or your skin colour or your social background. It's all of these things in complex variations. And our identity is not fixed. It's something which is made in culture and is therefore dynamic. He writes, and here's the quotation, "In much 20th century thinking, identity has come to be seen less as a given and more as a thing made through forms of representation. We represent ourselves through cultural activity, language, customs, dress, art, ritual. identifying with or against certain groups, customs or trends. This means though that we are always in part engaging with identifiers that are already in circulation, which have been pre-made, regulated and circulated through media and society. Our identity is a thing that gets made in culture, but it is not solely made by us and is, at least in part, made for us. Identity is at times a negotiation and at times a struggle. So as well as seeing identity as something which is layered and complex, as something which is changing and dynamic, we have to accept that our identities are partly that which we create in ourselves or about ourselves, but also draw on material from the world, from society and culture around us. So some of that social and cultural theory is actually quite difficult and rather abstract. If you don't get it straight away or don't see how it will apply, don't worry. The idea to carry forward into our discussions are basically the fact that identity, according to this theory, is not fixed and not simply given to us. It's not simply reduced to our passport or our skin colour or our religion or our nationality, but is many layered, is complex, is shifting, is something which is given to us from outside of society, but also that we make and can change over time. Identities can change for whole communities, for countries and nations, and also for individuals. It's that idea that really plays into the heart of our theme for today, which is to look at multicultural Germany and how Germany became multicultural through history. Now, at the end of the Second World War, Germany was completely shattered. It was a sea of rubble. Its political system was in ruins. It needed to be reconstructed from the ground upwards in every sense of the word. Many German men had either been killed or injured in the war or were still detained in prisoner of war camps after the war in the immediate aftermath of conflict. For that reason, the German government put out a call for guest workers, Gastarbeiter as they're called, to come to Germany and help do labour jobs to build, physically rebuild the German state and German cities and German infrastructure. The plan was not that so much that they stayed. In fact, the scheme had what was called a Rotationsprinzip, a rotation principle, that meant that migrants to Germany were not supposed to stay for more than 2 years and often change location, so they literally didn't put down roots. Despite this, the number of people coming, particularly from Turkey, grew. In the 1960s, 280,000 guest workers were in Germany, but by the 1970s this was over 4 million, as I say, with a large majority coming from Turkey, from a Muslim country on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, they brought with them their young children, and new children were born to their families, so soon you had multi-generational families. As the author Max Frisch, the German author Max Frisch reminds us, man hat Arbeitskräfte gerufen und es kommen Menschen. We called for labour and what we got were real people. And these real people brought with them their families. And it's precisely that multi-generational issue which is the complicating factor here. Because as soon as a child is born on German soil, where are they from? Who are they and where do they belong? They're both of their own culture of origin and of Germany. And it's really this generational question which feeds and drives this idea of migrant communities in Germany having this complex sense of identity. Once migrant communities produced their own children, as we've seen, complexity followed. Where do they belong? Who were they? Where were they from? Were they from both cultures or from one? On the political and official side, German Turks had to choose between holding a German or a Turkish passport for many years, and dual citizenship was only allowed in 2014. So German Turks had a particular experience which saw their identity, their national identity in the political sense, really pulled apart and existing in two halves. But what about other kinds of belonging? How else could German Turks feel German or not feel German? Feel Turkish or not feel Turkish? The question of language arises. The question of religion. Did Islam belong to Germany, which was ostensibly a Christian country? which was their first language. Of course, they will have spoken Turkish at home, and yet they also learned German in school. And their cultural affiliation, did they feel German or did they feel Turkish? Or more importantly, did they feel somehow in between, a mixture of both? And it's this state of feeling like you are in between two cultures that cultural theorists call hybridity. A hybrid is a mixture of two different things, and it's a term that's often been applied to migrant communities such as the Turks in Germany. The idea of being culturally hybrid or culturally complex or culturally mixed can be reflected in cultural production. By that I mean the art, the language, the culture which these migrant communities begin to create in their new homeland doesn't simply speak of Germany or Turkey, but of the mixed experience, the mixed sense of self these communities have. I'd like you to look at this poem, which is called Dazwischen, and it's by Alev Tekinay, who is a Turkish migrant to Germany. So she was born in Turkey, studied German and English at university, so she was quite educated, then came to Germany as a migrant herself and wrote a poem about her experiences. I'll read it for you. Dazwischen. Jeden Tag packe ich den Koffer ein und dann wieder aus. Morgens, wenn ich aufwache, plane ich die Rückkehr, aber bis Mittag gewöhne ich mich mehr an Deutschland. Ich ändere mich und bleibe doch gleich und weiß nicht mehr, wer ich bin. Jeden Tag ist das Heimweh unwiderstehlicher, aber die neue Heimat hält mich fest, Tag für Tag noch stärker. Und jeden Tag fahre ich 2000 Kilometer in einem imaginären Zug hin und her, unentschlossen zwischen dem Kleiderschrank und dem Koffer. Und dazwischen ist meine Welt. You can see, if you don't have German, from the English translation, that this is a poem precisely about being in between two worlds, two cultures. I'd like you to read through that poem and reflect on it. What is the message of the poem? What sense of self is it articulating? How does the poet feel she relates to Germany, German culture, and German language? Think about that for a moment, spend some time on it, make some notes, put your ideas aside, and we'll come back to that in our discussion. Now, the second source I'm going to get you to look at is an excerpt taken from a 2019 Netflix series, which is titled Skylines. Now, Skylines is a German TV series which has an English title, even in the original. It's called Skylines. It's called that because it plays in the city of Frankfurt. Now, Frankfurt is the financial capital of Germany and is quite famous for having a skyline of skyscrapers, much like New York or a large American city. But the action doesn't take place in the world of big finance and corporate life. It takes part much more on the street, and it focuses on the life of a young man, a young musician who goes by the street name of Jin. Now, Jin is a musician who does backbeats and soundscapes for rappers to rap to. He's the musical part of the hip-hop world, effectively. And after having tried to become famous with various collaborators, he catches the eye of a very established German rapper called Khalifa. And Khalifa and he start working together, and Jin is invited to join Skyline Records, and he thinks his career is taking off. It's at this point, though, that Adan comes back on the scene. Adan is the older brother of Khalifa, and he's mixed up in gangland warfare, in drugs and prostitution. And he starts threatening his younger brother. He wants money and he wants part control of the company. And he starts dragging both Khalifa and Jin back into this criminal world. In many ways, there's quite a few stereotypes there. The idea that hip-hop artists are always somehow caught up in criminality. There is, though, an ethnic dimension to this, because although Jin himself appears to be a white German young man, certainly Khalifa and his brother Adan are both Turkish Germans. So this is in many ways a study of how a particular generation of Turkish Germans have made their own place within German culture. Now, what I've got for you here is really only the trailer. It's about 1 minute and 30 seconds. If you're interested, it's a 15 cert, so if you're 15 or over, you can go and watch a little bit more on Netflix yourself. But even from this trailer, I'd like you to have a look at groups of people or individuals who you believe to be of mixed heritage, either Turkish or Turkish German. And I'd like you to try and work out what kind of people they are, how they're expressing themselves, and what their relationship is to Germany, German culture, and the German language, and how all of this somehow feeds into their art, their music, their hip-hop.
Adern. Er ist wieder in Frankfurt.
Ardan ist sowas wie eine Legende, war damals bei der Brigade. Er ist der Bruder von Khalifa, dem Rapper.
Ich höre keinen Rap.
06, 9, die Banken kratzen an dem Boden.
Wir haben Skyline Records aus dem Keller rausgeholt und guck, wo wir sind.
Wie komm ich an
Und wenn du nicht aufpasst, dann ist das Ganze ganz schlimm.
06, 9,
Du machst krasse Beats. Du brauchst Leute, die helfen, aufs nächste Level zu kommen.
die Höllenfahrt.
Produzenten-Exklusivvertrag. Was ist mit Mona?
Ja, es geht hier um Loyalität.
So, Loyalität. Ja.
Du bist gar nichts für die, verstehst du? Du bist zu schwach. Für die bist du eine kleine Ratte. Hörst du ab?
Was verkauft ihr überhaupt?
Ich gebe den Leuten, was sie brauchen.
Denkst du kannst mit mir handeln, Alter? Siehst du aus?
Skyline ist ein legales Unternehmen.
Ich habe dir geholfen, einen Traum zu verwirklichen. Jetzt hilfst du mir bei meinem.
Ich will, dass es weniger Angst gibt da draußen.
Vertrau mir.
Mach euch fertig!
Hast du Angst?
Dramatic stuff, I think you'll agree, and certainly exciting viewing. Hopefully you've got a little bit out of that clip on the basis of some of the ideas that we've been discussing today. Now, we're nearing the end of this presentation. When it comes down to the actual session that we have together, I'm going to begin the session by recapping some of these ideas, talking about mixed or hybrid cultural identities first. And then I'd like us to move on to look at 3 questions which relate to the sources that I've given you. I won't comment any more on those questions. I'll leave you to ponder them. But I look forward to seeing you in our session, and I hope this presentation has been interesting and helpful. See you soon.